What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Things You Don't Hear in Church podcast. My name's Ethan.
And my name's Derry, and today we have a very special guest, Kyle Costello. He's a super cool guy. He's a pastor in California, and he was raised Mormon. His grandpa was a Mormon bishop. His father was an elder, and we're here to talk to him today about Mormonism. So, Kyle, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
So, first question, asked this to a lot of people. Have you read all the books behind you?
Good question. Actually, those books, most of them, yes. We've gone through a couple of moves in the last few years, and so we got rid of a ton. And I wanted to keep the ones I knew what was in them. Just, seminary and many years now pastoring. It may look like a lot, but you break it down over that amount of time. It's not as impressive as maybe it looks like. Yeah,
that's pretty cool. I hope
what you don't know is there's not a book in the rest of our house. There's not a book.
They're all right there.
They're all right here.
Yeah. Keep them all consolidated.
That's so funny. Yeah. That's great. Yeah, we always have guests on and they have tons of books. And I think, how did you have time to read all of those books? Yeah. Although I guess I listen to books mostly, so I just don't have like as big of a stack of books everywhere. But
Yeah.
A few.
Yeah. So how long have you been pastoring? And then, what's your story coming out of Mormonism? If you were raised in it and all that good stuff.
Yeah, pastoring has been 17 years. So that's how long I've been pastoring. Started when I lived in Las Vegas, Nevada. If I backtrack from there, I grew up in kind of split between Utah and Eastern Nevada, kind of by the Utah border, depending on where my parents lived. The Mormon history is my family, 6th generation Mormon. My family came to faith in Mormonism while they lived in Europe. There were Mormon missionaries that were sent there in the 1850s by Brigham Young. They converted. They took a boat from Europe to New Orleans, and then from New Orleans pushed basically like a glorified wheelbarrow with their stuff in it from New Orleans over the Rocky Mountains into Utah.
Wow.
And then from there, they were deployed to live in an area right near Bryce Canyon. So if you've ever been to the national park there. And so that's just all I knew. I grew up in the faith, and I lived in Utah. Even when I lived in Nevada, it's still where that town in Nevada is connected to kind of Utah news, Salt Lake life and culture. Mormonism, they'll often call like, are you a Utah Mormon or a non-Utah Mormon? I was a Utah Mormon. So I knew nothing.
Higher class.
Well, yeah. Also that you just grow up, you think that's what the world is like.
Oh, gotcha.
So the culture and everything, like you're the home team everywhere you go. You never feel weird. Like it's the non-Mormons who are weird, not you. And so I never, I didn't meet anyone who would profess to be a Christian, I would say, until I was in college. And so that was just kind of the life I grew up in. I went to UNLV in Las Vegas for college. And it was during my first year there as a freshman. So I went to college as a 17-year-old. I couldn't go on a mission.
Wow.
So my plan was to take the first year and prepare to go on my mission. I was the oldest of 7 of us. And my plan was to kind of just keep the story going. So I was going to prepare and study. I had done all the things I was supposed to do in Mormonism. 12 years old, I got the Aaronic priesthood. You're a deacon, you're a teacher, then you're a priest at 16. I used to always joke with my friends they needed to call me a priest, father, when I was 16. And graduated from Mormon seminary. It's something you go to when you're in high school. And so I was going to take this year and I was going to get ready to go. And I had this awesome roommate that I got paired with in the dorms. And he was he was a theater major. And he was like, hey, I'll help you. I don't know anything about Mormonism, but I'll like role play with you. He's like, do you want me to be like the East Coast liberal or the Southern evangelical? And he would go full character, and we would awesome. We would go at it. And he was also pretty brilliant. And he started to ask questions that maybe growing up in my little bubble, I'd never asked. And I'm not going to say those questions. I didn't think, oh, we're not going to be able to find an answer to these, or this is going to be my gateway to leaving the faith. They just sent me down a road of actually conversations with my family, my father first, and then my grandfather that did lead to me leaving the faith. So I would go home on breaks and I would talk to my dad about it. He had always been my number one, kind of educator, counselor in the faith. And when maybe he came up with the answers that I had come up with in my head, I wasn't satisfied with those. I would push a bit more. And he wasn't super comfortable with that. He told me it was time I needed to talk to the bishop, and the bishop was my grandpa. And so and sometimes they can come off not so great in this story, but they're pretty fantastic dudes who you'd love, but they're devout Mormons. I mean, and so I remember going into my grandpa's office, and it was go time. Like, he was serious.
Wow.
And I remember him saying, "Hey, Kyle, what gives you the right to question this?" He's like, "You're questioning me, your father, your great grandfather, your great great grandfather, and he's like, let's just be honest. Like, you're 18. What gives you that right to do that?" And I remember like going in my head for the first time, going, I don't know if this is first of all, I don't think this is a legitimate question. Second of all, I think both him and my dad were trying to keep me from maybe an area that they hadn't wrestled with. Now that's just me. That's just me. That's just my conjecture. Like, I'm sure if they were on this with me, they would be like, absolutely not. But that's what I felt. And so we ended up being in that office for about 3 hours. Man, it was intense. And I remember walking across the parking lot to go to my car when I left the church that night, and thinking for the first time in my head that maybe this isn't true. Wow. And that's a really big deal when you've grown up in Mormonism. I can't express that enough. Like, I know now you can go into churches, some Christian churches, and they're like, "Hey, doubt is okay. Bring your doubts." That is never said in Mormonism. Like, you never ever confess to doubt. You never confess to questions. And so in my head, to just intellectually go, maybe this isn't true, at some level, it felt like it was going to change my life some way, because it was either the gateway to me leaving, or it was like the biggest sin I could have committed, because you don't do that in that faith.
Right.
And so I left. It was Thanksgiving at the time. It was the Thanksgiving break.
Wow.
So I went back to school, and I was supposed to just be studying, for finals. And I don't think I studied at all. I had the Book of Mormon and I had the Doctrine and Covenants. And those are two books that Mormons believe are scripture. And I just started to read both of those. I had read both of them cover to cover several times at that point. But I started to see how they contradicted each other, how they were different. One was written before there were any followers. So the Book of Mormon was written by Joseph Smith before there were any followers, where the Doctrine and Covenants was written after he had gained a following and as he continued to amass followers. And so the theology and the faith in the two books are remarkably different. Right. And so I would say that, because I've been inoculated against looking at any book outside of Mormonism. And so it was those two books, their own scripture, that led me to go, like, I don't think this is true anymore. And by the time I went home for Christmas, I told my parents that I was out.
Wow.
So it was.
Do you remember what that question was that you asked your grandpa that kind of got you thinking, I don't know if this is true?
Yeah. So this was before I had even asked him a question. He was just going, "Hey, I've heard what you've been talking to your dad, and basically what gives you the right to question this?" But I will tell you that what the question that I was focused on when I read both the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants was basically, who is God and what is our purpose in knowing God? And in those two books, I would say they have remarkably different answers. And so the Book of Mormon, which, most Mormon scholars will admit, like, several large sections of it were plagiarized from scripture, from the Bible. Influenced heavily by the Great Awakening, or the Second Great Awakening, even, and evangelical thought and beliefs. So you see in the Book of Mormon a history, but as they talk about God, I think you would say it's more of a triune like God that we would understand as an eternal triune like God, where once you get to the Doctrine and Covenants, it's a God who is definitely more human, definitely separate, definitely distinct from like Father, Son, Holy Ghost. That's what they would call it.
Yeah.
And then also the elements of your own ability to become a God are introduced there. And so God is understood as he used to be this human who just self-actualized and then done such a great job that he was given his own planet, and that we can become that as well. Now it's not like spelled out in black and white, but that's the theological framework that it's working with.
Very interesting.
Very different.
Yeah. So do we want to start to go over some of the differences between Christianity and Mormonism? Because I think the number one thing that most people who know Mormons usually know about them is they say, oh, we're the same. Like, you're a Christian, I'm a Christian, right? And they use a lot of the same language. Like, you start to try to figure out the differences. You're like, oh, we all like, they know all the words that I know. It's kind of confusing if you don't look into it like very deeply. So can you tell us a little bit about what the like main differences are?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's how that was my path to ministry. So I came to faith about 5 years after I left Mormonism.
Wow.
And I was on this like weird, I don't know, like this weird divide, this weird chasm of the generations prior to me. They never, both Mormons would have said, we're not Christians, because that's my family. Like my family, like, we're not Christians. Like those people are correct. And then the generation me and after, that was when Gordon B. Hinckley, who was their prophet at the time, started to use words like, we're Christians too.
Wow.
I mean, he was this is the late 90s, early 2000s. So he's the prophet at the time. He had also been in the 1960s, their first ever PR guy. And so in a way, like the Olympics were going to Salt Lake City, the world was going to see them. And he goes on 60 Minutes and says, like, hey, we're Christians too, in a way. And and specifically, like, the younger generations grab onto that. Yeah. And so all I had known growing up was Christians were like, you're not us. And Mormons were like, yeah, we're not you. And then I come to faith in this new reality of like, no, we're Christians too. And it gets really confusing. And I don't know if I'm supposed to yell at you or accept you. Like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. And so I started teaching classes on called Your Mormon Neighbor that were based completely on this. The fact that the vocabulary is the exact same. And so we never know what each other means. When you say God, when I say blessing, when I say, the scriptures. And so we just started to walk through it. And the number one way that I would always say to begin to just unpack it is just say, hey, why do you think you're here? Why have you been created by God? Like, why is God here? Like, what is his purpose? What is his intent? Because you can get hung up in all of the vocabulary and how you define it. But if you start at the end in a way, it helps at least define how you are progressing and how you're moving forward. And for a Christian, I mean, if you just look at Reformation definitions, like if we're here to worship God and enjoy him forever, like if he is it, if he's the goal, if he's all of it, then that's very different than a Mormon, where your goal is actually to self-actualize. Like it's to hit the markers, it's to progress. Like I always say, and I'm not trying to get into Calvinism or Arminianism. I always say though, it is the most Arminian faith on the planet. Like you can choose everything. Like you can make yourself into everything. And like even to the point of godhood. And so when you start there, not like antagonistically or anything, just like, hey, like I've sat down with missionaries a lot, and sometimes we get into the, what is happening in this book of the Bible or what is happening here. And I'm like, okay, great. Like, I know we're both frustrated with each other because we're not hearing each other, but why do you believe you exist? And what's your goal and what's your end? Like my end is Jesus. Like that's it. Like my end is to be with God. And then it's like, oh, okay, right. No, my end is to hit these markers and to keep going. It doesn't mean that God isn't someone you love or have a relationship with, or who isn't there, who's desiring your well-being. I'm not trying to tell Mormons that he's not that, but they know that ultimately their goal is to become God. There was a saying I was taught when I was a little, which was, as man is, God once was; as God is, man may become.
Wow.
And their fourth prophet said that. And like when I would say that as a kid, like my parents like, yeah, you know, because it's just like this little thing you do. But that's how I start.
Wow, so interesting. I was talking to my friend one time, and he had a conversation with one of his good friends who was a Mormon. He might be listening to this, I'm not sure. So if you are, thanks for the story. And he had these three friends, and one of them wasn't a Christian. He just started hanging out with them. One of them was a Mormon, and then it was him. And he came back from his DTS, and he was in this hot tub, and he was talking to this Mormon friend of his, and the Mormon friend was like, they're both trying to evangelize like subtly to their other friend who wasn't a Christian at the same time. And they kind of came to this confrontation where like the Mormon guy was like, well, I'm a Christian too. We're the same. And my friend was like, you know, and I know we're both not the same, and that you're just saying that like for this person. And he's like, let's just talk about it like openly and get to the bottom of like what the difference is. And at the very like base level, he got to that the God that his Mormon friend was following wasn't eternal, because he asked the question like, well, who created that God, right? And we have an answer to that as Christians. And so he like kind of displayed this difference of what is like the original thing in your religion versus what mine was. Would you say Mormons have an answer for that? Because his friend didn't have an answer at the time for him. He just thought, well, I'll become a god and my children will hopefully become gods too, just like, you know, the God of the Bible was a god before them and stuff like that. And he didn't have an answer to what was original.
No, in a way they don't. So in the early, I've brought this up a few times just to give you context. So, you know, Mormons believe in a prophet that he still speaks for God. So when I quote a prophet a few minutes ago, like I'm not saying that offhandedly, like that's like C.S. Lewis, or that's like for us, like some writer. They believe when he speaks, like he speaks for God, and that means as much as a book of scripture. So when a prophet says like, as man is, God once was, like that's not just him riffing or him like interpreting. He's going for it. In the early 1980s, right when I know none of you guys were around yet, but they had these big, I don't know if you've even seen them, but these gigantic satellites started happening. So I was a little boy, and all of a sudden these gigantic satellites started popping up. Some people would put them in their yards, but like schools would get them, and you could like in our grade school, we could watch what was happening like in China, like a newscast or something, because it was beamed through these gigantic satellites. Well, in Mormonism, at the time, they were always struggling with when they would do massive gatherings, like they do twice a year. They do what's called General Conference, and then they do these priesthood gatherings where all the men get together, and they couldn't broadcast it to people like beyond the United States or maybe, you know, Canada. And so they got these satellites, and so they're beaming it now worldwide. All of the men of the church are together, and the prophet stands up and he says something like, don't quote me on the literal numbers, but like 300,000 of you are watching this tonight. And he goes, it's my belief that 300,000 of you will be gods of your own world someday.
Wow.
And so, no, he wouldn't have an answer. And no, they wouldn't have an answer. Like they will say he's all eternal, like in the concept of our existence, right? Because he's always existed. But that's very different, you and I know, than what the Orthodox Christian understanding of that is.
Right. Yeah. Philosophically, it's a completely different definition.
Yeah. And I guess the question I would ask them would be like, well, why would you want to worship this God who used to be human? If you dig back far enough, there has to be a source. There has to be a beginning.
Right.
And if you're going to say that beginning is a God that is not created, why not just worship that God that's not created rather than this old human in a sense? I'd bet, wouldn't that make more sense?
So they have no real answer for cosmology at all? Do they just go back to evolution or something?
That's a good question. I don't think we ever even, the beautiful, I don't know about the beautiful thing. I don't want to be, I always like to say, guys, like the thing, it gets easy sometimes when we're talking about Mormonism for me, and even in Christian circles, like, and I don't feel like you guys are doing this at all, but it's easy to take shots or like kind of
right.
like, And I always say, like, I want to respect them. The people outside of my wife and my sons that I love most in the world are Mormons. And so, so I think I was going down a road of like maybe saying a little something smart. But the thing that is tricky about this is where the allegations of like the cultish idea come in. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, it's when you have a prophet who sets the mark and who says this is how this goes. If you have a question like that, like, and he says, hey, that's not what we're going to focus on, or we don't understand what that means. Like, you just then don't go down those lines. There's not like this robust, like, intellectual machine that you're like, oh, well, the prophet said that, but I'm still going to take it on myself, you know?
Right.
And so it's, you kind of can't think of it in the same terms as we think of how we maybe pursue answers. I don't mean to, I don't know if I'm saying that well, but
I understand what you mean. Yeah.
Right. Well, it's their worldview that like it's just not a concept for them to ask these questions. If the prophet says, "Hey, we're not going to go down that road," it's not this. I would assume most Mormons is not a thing where it's like, "Well, that's not right. You should answer this question." It's like, "Well, okay, cool," and they just move on because of the upbringing they've had and the worldview they hold. They're like, "Yeah, that's how it is," and they just keep on keeping on.
Now the internet is challenging them in that, right? It's so much tougher now for them to do that because everybody has all this information at their fingertips. And so even, I mean, I spent the last close to 10 years in Salt Lake City, and the amount of times I saw that the groups of people challenge the prophet was crazy to me. Like, I'd never seen that growing up. And it's, I just, 99% of it is the internet and social media. Because when I thought I was leaving the Mormon church, I thought I was the only person in history that had ever done it. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but that's just what my mind thought.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But if you jump on and you hear a podcast, or you see even someone just posted on Instagram or something like that, like all of a sudden you're like, oh, I'm not the only one, or I'm not the only one asking these questions. And that's what, I think that's been that's why you haven't seen, in my opinion, their numbers grow over the last decade.
Right. Yeah, man. Yeah. Especially on TikTok, like Mormons are huge. I went through this phase maybe a year ago where I just got super fascinated in Mormon deconstruction and like just what the process was. I don't know why it was so interesting to me. So I just started watching all these videos, and the algorithm kept like bringing me more videos. What's really interesting is the #1 biblical scholar on TikTok. I think he has millions of followers, is a Latter-day Saint guy. And he rips apart his own faith, but he is like a Latter-day Saint and like will defend it. And when I say like he's a biblical scholar, he's not like the most renowned, but he does have like a PhD in textual criticism, I think. He's easily like the #1 like answer when people have like Bible questions on there. The problem is that he answers everything. He tries to say from an objective standpoint, but it's obvious like all of his conclusions are the Mormon conclusion for things. And stuff like that. But you wouldn't know it unless you were like in that world and talked about it all the time. Otherwise, he just sounds super smart, and like he can debate any normal person on like, oh, well, it's the scholarly consensus, so you can't like go against what I'm saying, kind of a thing. When actually it might not actually be. It's just like what he's saying. So it's super interesting. So a lot of people are like trying to figure out how to combat that. But yeah, there's tons of people on TikTok that are Mormons that are like having conversations all the time and going back and forth. So the internet has definitely opened up like a big conversation around that lately.
It's fascinating.
Him being a scholar, if he says his scholarly consensus is, can you just say his opinion because he's a scholar?
No, scholarly consensus would be all the scholars.
Right.
I'm going to become a scholar then. I'm just going to tell people.
All you need is a lot of books. A lot of books.
We're getting there.
Yeah, I see that. It looks good.
Yes, most of my books are in the office. Though.
Yeah,
that's awesome. So what other differences are there between Christianity and Mormonism? I know most Mormons will just be like, look, we have the same Bible. And then we'll kind of go from there and start using the same words. Can you talk about that at all?
Sure. I mean, so if you talk about scripture, big differences. They have these 13 articles of faith. So if you turn to the end of the Pearl of Great Price, which they believe is a book of scripture, they have these 13 articles of faith that they kind of just line out, here's what we believe. And in one of those articles of faith, they say, like, we believe in the Book of Mormon, we believe in the Doctrine and Covenants, we believe in the Pearl of Great Price. So those are 3 books of scripture that obviously Orthodox Christianity would not consider legitimate at all.
Right.
And then it says, then when it goes to the Bible, it says, we believe in the Bible as far as it is translated correctly.
Wow.
So it's the only one with the asterisk. So the way I was raised growing up was to believe that the Bible was handed down in a way like a game of telephone. You know, you ever play that in like youth group where it's like, you say Johnny ate a double cheeseburger to the first person, and then by the end it's like Sally ate a taco or something.
Right.
And so there's always this inherent skepticism that revolves around the Bible. And when you say, like, as long as it's translated correctly, the question obviously is, well, how does one know when it's translated correctly? And then you defer to the leadership of the church.
Right.
So they let you know when it's translated correctly.
Very interesting.
So, I mean, that's massive. And when I hate saying this because I feel like I'm exposed a little bit, but the first time I went into a Christian, so I left Mormonism. I'm 18 years old. I leave Mormonism. I don't go to a Christian service it's not like I was like, I didn't have some existential crisis, like who's God? And I was searching. I just was in college and I was having fun. And so I just went back to college. And then 2 years later, I got invited to my first church service and I went, and I don't know if it was the first time or the second or third time or whatever, but in one of the sermons, you know, like a preacher does, he refers to the original language of the Bible. And I was like, what's that? You know, he didn't even say Greek or Hebrew or anything. And so, like, I remember going down that road of like, what was this? Oh, the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. Okay, some Aramaic, some in the New Testament in Greek, and like going, I have no idea that's what they were translating these things from. And then I went down the road of starting to understand textual criticism and different ways that we get the text that we get. And I was like, oh, so that game of telephone wasn't true at all. And actually the Bible, which I always had the skepticism about, stands on much more solid foundation than these other 3 books that I did not. So that's pretty huge. They would believe things like marriage is necessary for you to reach that ultimate level of heaven. So they believe in 3 different heavens. They believe in the celestial, the terrestrial, and the telestial kingdom. And then they believe in an outer darkness. Now, one Mormon apostle has said, like, you can count on 2 hands the amount of people that will go to outer darkness. And so some people will say, like, well, that means like Mormonism is a type of universalism because those levels of heaven are all levels of heaven. Like Joseph Smith said, if you saw the lowest heaven, which is the telestial kingdom, that you would commit suicide to get into it. It's that beautiful. But that's where like all of the murderers, the worst of the worst, the apostates, people like me, we would go to the telestial kingdom. You guys are good Christians, you would go to the terrestrial kingdom. That's kind of the middle. And then the best of the best, you can visit me too. You guys could visit me.
Well, really, we can go down a level.
I can't visit up, but you could visit down. You can come say hey.
And on the first floor in the apartment.
The celestial kingdom is the top, and the celestial kingdom actually has 3 different levels in it. And so you can get to the celestial kingdom without being married, but you have to have a temple marriage in order to get to the highest level of the celestial kingdom to continue through what they would call eternal progression. And so marriage is unique that way. Heaven is unique that way, like in the way that it's set up. Even the grading of what they would call the Godhead, so they don't believe in a triune God, but rather 3 distinct gods. So they're completely separate. So because think about it, like they were born at different times. Like the Father, God, he was on a different planet. He self-actualized. And then Jesus, and then there's the Holy Ghost. And the Holy Ghost it's the one that he kind of reigns over that lowest kingdom, the celestial kingdom. Jesus over that middle kingdom, the terrestrial kingdom, and then the Father over the celestial kingdom. And so in a way, even they grayed out the Godhead. I don't know that they would say it that way, but the way it's kind of attached to those three, I feel comfortable saying that.
Yeah, that's interesting, because going back to, like, I guess, like, where did the first God come from? I feel like they can't intellectually honestly say that they believe in a one God. It sounds like crazy pantheism.
Oh yeah, I mean that's often brought up in debates. Anytime you see like a Mormon and a Christian scholar, like you know, your prophets, your everything would say that there's literally could be millions of gods and millions of planets all over the place.
Right.
Yeah. And
so would
there's
they
not
even
a lot
claim monotheism? Sorry.
Yeah. I don't want to speak. Yes, they would claim it. I don't know how they explain it. Like, I don't know how they. I wish I had a better answer for you. They would claim monotheism because God the Father is who, like, kind of sets the tone. I think because in a way they're graded out. But I don't know how else they would get there from the questions that obviously come up.
Right. Yeah, I get that's so interesting. I'd be so curious to hear what they...
Do you know, like, within the Godhead, is one of them like more God than the others in like a henotheistic way, or would it be more like polytheistic, like they're all kind of equal, but they're all gods?
Yeah, my gut says always the Father is the ultimate. Like, this is his world. This is his thing. Like, even he's tied to the celestial kingdom. Like, he's the one who's connected at the highest level, and what you would see is like the most pure form of who you could be and what you could be. And so and he's the one that, like, when you say God, you mean him. You don't mean Jesus. Right, you know, there's no like praying to Jesus. Like, you hear people, you know, in Christianity all the time, like, pray to Jesus or whatever. Like, it's praying to God the Father.
Okay.
Right.
Wow, the more we talk about it, and I'm thinking to myself, man, like, the implications of what they believe would lead us, if they were true, I feel like would lead to such an interesting world. Like, if it was true that humans could become gods, or created beings could become gods and have our own little planet, that means there's an infinite possible amount of, like, other planets that have life. Which, if that was the case, and if Mormonism took over the world, I feel like science would be like, let's go find these people, and then let's go hang out.
That's a great point. Yeah.
And then I would be like, if I was a Mormon, I'd become an astronaut and be looking for other life.
There's actually a show called The Expanse, and in it, like, one of the main arcs is that there's this giant ship, and it's all Mormons, and they're out there searching for other Mormons.
That's awesome.
It's pretty crazy. Yeah. It's great. It's a really good show. It's like one of the best space shows out there. Yeah. Very interesting.
That's wild.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
A big thing, so a big, massive tenet, and just to keep going with the differences that Mormons believe in, why they think that they're like the true church, is they believe, like, after the original disciples were killed, that God removed his authority from the earth, and his authority was the priesthood, they call it. And then he brought it back through Joseph Smith. And there's two parts to the priesthood: the Aaronic priesthood, which is you get it as a male. It's only for males, age 12 through 18. That's what I said earlier when I said I was a deacon, I was a teacher, I was a priest. That's all part of the Aaronic priesthood. And then after that is the Melchizedek priesthood. And that is basically when you go on your mission, you get conferred with your Melchizedek priesthood. You have to have the Melchizedek priesthood to be a bishop, to be a general authority, to be like to bless people. They believe that has the power. That's how they were able to reestablish the temples on the earth. All the temples that they built, it's all off of the power of the Melchizedek priesthood. So even it's honored so much. If you go to Temple Square in Salt Lake City, they have these two massive statues. And one is when God brought back the Aaronic priesthood and kind of conferred it on Joseph Smith and his people, and the other is when he brought back the Melchizedek priesthood. And so they would say that's what sets them apart. That's what makes them the one true church, is they hold the priesthood.
Oh, gotcha. Very interesting.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
What is the role of women in the Mormon tradition?
Yeah, it's always been seen as like they're there to produce the children. Like, they're there to bring about, like, because when you're producing children, I know that can sound man, as misogynistic or as patriarchal as utilitarian as.
But you're making God
just
a little
brutal.
bit.
Exactly, and
You're
you're making like the
machine.
people for your kingdom.
Yeah.
Like they're going to populate who
job.
you are going to be into perpetuity. Like another thing that would, if you're married in eternity and you continue on, you continue to have children, like propagate, like it just keeps going. And so it's, in a way, that is your calling. Like it's to be married, it's to be married eternally, and it's to support the priesthood the priesthood holder in your house as he kind of leads the way towards this goal.
Interesting. Wow.
And then so they partake. If a woman is unmarried, what part of heaven does she go to? Like what's the highest a woman can go by herself?
Now a woman or a man can go to the celestial kingdom. But how I was always taught is they cannot get to that highest level. Like at some level you stop if you aren't married in order to move forward. I mean, I know this podcast isn't about this, but they took kind of the way the reformers took the way the Catholics had elevated singleness to the point of, like priests and nuns, and we just kind of chucked it and we ran too far the other way. They took that and added some steroids to it, like where they don't just kind of intimate that you need to be married to like really know God. They actually say it. And so it's that's what they would see marriage as.
Wow, very interesting.
Yeah.
Going back a second to God and there being Mormons everywhere and stuff like that, is becoming a God more progressive, or is it sort of like an instantaneous, like an enlightenment kind of thing? Because my question would be like, where, if it's like a process, where are all the like in between people that aren't gods but are like halfway there? You know what I mean?
It's absolutely progressive. So they call it like the doctrine of eternal progression. And so like when we die, like we would go to a place where we would continue on. And so that's where they would say those people are in. They don't have a great answer for like, if you're like deputy God or vice God and you're about ready to take the next step. I don't know where they're like working that out, but they definitely would not believe. They would believe like this. There's a movement that's continually happening outside of our work and on earth here all the time. I mean, that's why they do all the temple work that they do. And so like for you guys, when you die, Mormons will try to get your name and they will do temple work for you. So when I was a kid, when I was 12, once I turned 12, I would go and I would get baptized for people who had died, who had not received Mormonism here. Like I always say on the Michael Jordan of baptism, I've been baptized over 300 times. I can baptize myself, but then you will, because you will be in an afterlife. Where then someone will come and present Mormonism to you, and you'll have the chance to accept it. And now because you didn't believe it here, you won't ever be able to get to the highest of the highest levels, but you'll still be able to progress. So there's always this understanding, this doctrine of eternal progression that everyone is invited into.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Cool. Do you have any other differences between Mormons and Christians at all?
I mean, I'm sure there are some. I'm just saying, like those. When you talk about the priesthood, when you talk about the temple work, you talk about marriages, you talk about scripture. Like to me, those are the ones where if you're a friend, like you're dialoguing with your Mormon friend, like just ask good questions about those.
Right.
Don't tell them what they know. Nobody likes that. You don't like that. I don't like that. Ask good questions about those things. And then you don't have to like be like, hey, come on, we don't believe the same thing. Like it'll just be so obvious. Like as we talk now, it's like, oh yeah, like these aren't even close to being the same thing.
Right.
Definitely.
Yeah, so I guess that leads into the next question. Like, how should a Christian go about conversating with Mormons? Because I know, like, sometimes I'll be walking out of Walmart and I'll see two of the Mormon missionaries walking up. And one time I just got back from my DTS and I was walking out of Walmart and I saw two young guys approach this woman for evangelism. And I was like, oh, I'm also a missionary. I'm also going to go talk to them and sabotage this whole thing. And so I just kind of walked
Ethan
up.
is so confrontational. I would never do this. So
I just thought, like, I can't let this poor woman be evangelized by them right now. And so I just walked up and started talking to them. I was like, you guys missionaries? They're like, yeah. I was like, dude, me too. I just got back from the Philippines. And they're like, oh, yeah. And like, jumped up some conversation until we all dispersed, went our ways. And I was like, all right, cool. And then like the following week, I was at a coffee shop with my friend reading the Bible. And so they walked around the corner, these Mormon guys, and they're like, oh, you guys reading the Bible? We're like, yeah. Like, I was like, you guys are Mormons, right? And they're like, Latter-day Saints. I was like, oh, sorry. I always, whenever I ask if they're Mormon, they always tell me they're Latter-day Saints. And I feel like, oh yeah. I'm not, they don't like that. So I always try to remember that I'm not supposed to say that.
Yeah.
But we invited them to sit down and we just had a great conversation, and then asked them some questions about their faith, and they did their best to answer it. And then eventually they referred me to their website for further questions. But yeah, so what's the best way to talk to Mormons when we encounter them? And because also at university, whenever we go to evangelize at the university, you run into tons of people who are like, oh yeah, I'm Mormon, and they sound really Christian. They're like, yeah, I'm saved by grace through faith in Jesus Christ, and it's nothing I can do on my own. And I'm like, they're like preaching the gospel, and I'm like, I think either we have radically different understandings, or you're just a Christian and you don't know it.
Yeah. What that means to them is that his death gets you into the celestial kingdom. So that's what they're saying. Okay. Like the grace of God was given when Jesus came, died on the cross. That gets everybody into that lowest level of heaven. And so for them, they feel comfortable intellectually saying that. And that's why some people would say it's like a universalistic, because you could say the same thing. You'd be like, oh yeah, Mormonism allows me that too. Because it does in their mind. Like, unless you've been someone who's literally known Jesus and rejected him, or you've been like the most evil of evil, like whenever I would ask, like, well, who is in that outer darkness? There's always the two answers I got from every person, Judas and Hitler. Like, those are always the two people who were like in the outer darkness. But I think to go back to your question, I think you've answered it in the way that you've done it. Like, I don't feel like, so I sit in this weird line of Gen X. I'm either like the youngest of the Gen X or the oldest of the millennials. And I feel like in that generation, right there, we started to not have a problem with being mean to them. Like older generations, that's how they dealt with them. Get off my property, get out of here. You're members of cults, like you scream stuff out. I mean, I would get handed pamphlets that had like Jesus with like the Jesus you believe in. He'd have fangs and he had fire shooting out of his eyes. And then it would be like, you need to repent and turn, you know? And I'd be like, yeah, like I'm going to trust you. Thanks for handing me this, you know? So I feel like what turn a bit. And when I first started teaching classes, it would be a mix of people who wanted to just go like, boom, punch them hard, and a mix of people who were like, I just feel like they're Christians. And and so it was like, no, like the best way that you can evangelize the Mormons is, number one, know your own faith. Like, dig deep into why you believe. Ask good questions about your faith so that you can ask good questions about their faith. Because if you haven't asked good questions about your faith, it's going to be exposed like that. And you're going to be off on you're going to be on your heels. You're not going to know what's going on here. And so, and then it is just be kind. Like, I've had a bunch of brothers who went on missions, and I'm grateful that you sat down with them and just had a conversation. Like, that's what I know. Like, sometimes I would just say, we lived in Las Vegas at the time. I was like, it's 110 degrees. They're wearing suits and they're riding a bike. Invite them in and give them some water and just be kind and ask good questions. Like, who knows what it could lead to? If someone is on a mission, think about it. Like, they're out there. I mean, you guys know this a little bit. Like, you're sold out for what you're doing. Like, you're not doing this unless, man, you're willing to put some flesh on the line. Like, you're going for it. So they might not be in the best place to really just, deconstruct everything they've ever thought about their faith. That doesn't mean you shouldn't ask good questions. But if you think like, oh man, they're ripe for the picking, I don't know about that. However, you could ask good questions, and who knows what's going to come out 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, 15 years down the line. Any of the people that I've seen leave Mormonism, like especially, leading a church in Salt Lake for almost 10 years, like rarely was it ever instant instant conversion. For me, I went to a Mormon church for I went to a Christian church for almost 3 years before I would ever say I was a Christian. I went to every class they taught. I read every book they gave. One of the teachers at one point was like, one of the pastors was like, Kyle, we don't have any more classes. Like, he's like, I don't know what to do. But you're so, again, inoculated against asking good questions or thinking you have the intellectual space to even deal with them, process them, that it takes a while before you will let your guard down, even to yourself, to let it sink in that maybe there's something else out there.
Right. Right. That's so dangerous. Like, you would be unraveling not only like what you believe, but like the foundation of everything you think reality is, all of your family, all of your loved ones, all these things is a big process.
Yeah. Something I've heard a lot about, like, different cults and stuff like that, is that they use a lot of fear tactics to keep people from asking questions. And I would assume that kind of is probably what they're experiencing too. Like, oh, I cannot question the prophet. He's speaking on behalf of God. And, and with that understanding, I feel like it should lead everyone who encounters Mormonism, and like when they come to the door or when you're out and about, should lead us Christians to be so empathetic to them and be like, oh my gosh, you're like a prisoner of this fear to ask questions and discover and explore. And that's like, you have like God-given freedom to do all of that, and that's been like tainted and shut down in their minds. So it should,
and think about this too. You're dead on. And think about this too. It's the prophet, but they don't know him. They just know him as this authority figure. What they're afraid of is questioning that prophet and then being ostracized from their community. Like, it's such a tight-knit community. Right. And so if they're processing what it looks like to step away from their community, yet what they're meeting is a rigid or an angry person, like in Christianity, it's like, I don't know if I want to be there. Like,
right.
And so, like, I was so blessed. Like, the first small group I went to, I'd probably been a Christian a couple years. They were so kind to me. They were so like forgiving. Like, I would say answers sometimes, and one of the small group leaders was like, Kyle, that's not in the Bible, man. And I'd be like, oh, right, I think that's in the Book of Mormon. Like, and they didn't like, mock me or shun me, or they were like, hey, no, here, well, I didn't want to be baptized, you guys. Like, I'd been baptized over 300 times. Like, that was like a painful memory for me. And so I was like, it's grace, baby. I don't need to be baptized. Like, it's not, I don't need to do anything. That was kind of my mantra for like my first 5 years of Christianity. And I had patient, just fellow Christians who sit down with me and go like, hey, well, what if we thought about this differently? Let's look at these passages and just ask some questions about them. To where, like, now my baptism is like one of my most, like, most valuable things in my life, in my history. And at first I was just dead set against it. And so I think you're modeling that already. There's a great book. It's not, I don't think you would read it and go like, wow, I never thought of these tactics. But it's a guy who is a Christian who has done ministry in Salt Lake City for, probably now, I think over 40 years. David Rowe is his name. Back when there was a seminary in Salt Lake, he was a prof there. And it's just called I Love Mormons. And all it is about his, in a way, it's like his biography of how he's just lived life with them and like honored them as image bearers of God, and also been willing to ask good questions whenever he was afforded the opportunity or invited in. And so there is a way, but it's not simple and clean, it's not like quick.
Yeah. I love what you said about they're having to face the reality of leaving their community, because I think we forget that in our Western mindset, that like, if you're stepping away from your belief, you're stepping away from such a close community. Because
they're so individualistic.
Yeah, I would say that Mormon culture internally is way more close-knit than most modern Americans in their life, right? And when you say that, I'm reminded of like my friends I have in Cambodia who are like, they're like, when I left Buddhism, I lost everything. Like, my family kicked me out and I left my village. Like, I had to leave. Yeah. Because they became Christian. They're like crying, but they're like, I'm crying not because I'm sad, but because like God has given me so much more since I became a Christian. And stuff. And so it's like when I think about it with that mindset of like, it's the same thing as like asking someone who's Thai to be a Christian, because the Thai people, they think like my Buddhism is me being Thai. So if I become a Christian, I'm not tie anymore.
Right.
It's almost like if I was to deconvert from Christianity, I might think like I'm not American. I don't have all the rights of the American citizen.
Right.
And so
classically,
so with all that mindset of like, this is my community, this is my family, this is my future, this is my past, this is my family line, my generation.
Right.
It's like, that's a huge
There's a lot of
deal.
pressure on
Yeah.
that.
It's not like no one in any world or switches in one conversation, all that stuff.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. We had speaking on like evangelism to Mormons, we had Mormons come to our base for a while. I'm pretty sure we're blacklisted now because they haven't come back in like 3 years or so. But we had this one guy who would always come back, and he would talk to one staff specifically while we're eating lunch. And he came a couple times, and the guy, we just got him like questioning so much just by asking questions that the next time they came back to our property, it was, I don't know if it was a bishop or just a higher up person and a different person on their mission that came, and we were like, oh, where's this guy? Like, he was here before, and they were like, oh, he's not on island anymore. Like he like had to go somewhere else because I think he was in crisis of his faith, so they sent him off island.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
I've had the same exact things happen where I've been in conversation with a specific set of missionaries, and I'll feel like in a way I'm even getting traction with one of them, and then we'll show up to. We would always go to Jamba Juice and have smoothies, and I'd show up and he's gone, and I'm like, well, where is he? And I go, well, he got transferred to such and such and such and such, and I was like, oh,
right,
okay.
Yeah.
And the sad thing is they don't get their own, at least for their mission, they don't get their own phones. They have a little flip phone that they share, right?
I do think that's changed now. So I don't know this for sure. But see, when my brothers went, they didn't have any phone, and so they had to go to another member's house to call, because they could only call on, at the time, they could only call on Mother's Day and Christmas.
Oh,
and so you would go to another member's house and you would call in front of them. But my youngest brother that just went, and talking to my dad, I didn't ask him specifics, but it sounded like he had a phone on him, and if he was using it in front of his companion, the other, like he could call home, he could check in, things like that. And it was my brother's phone, like it was his legitimate phone.
Okay.
So I don't. Sometimes the rules like that change, and I also think they're different by mission. Like sometimes mission presidents will throw down different rules if he feels he has like an unruly bunch, or if he feels like he has a super dialed in bunch.
Yeah. Last year I worked with a few Mormons at the food distribution.
Okay.
And each of them had their own phone, like their own personal phone, but they shared the same number. And so they had like the same SIM card that was like dual, so they could still make the same calls, but they would all get the same texts and stuff like that to like the two different phones.
So they could track it and see it. That makes sense. I get it.
But yeah, they told me they had different rules for different like areas.
Yeah, because the ones I met like 3 or 4 years ago, they had like one flip phone between the two of them.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, that's crazy. Because I was like, what's your number? Let's like hang out later. And he pulled out his flip phone, and I was like, oh, I haven't seen that in so long.
Yeah.
But yeah, because I feel like that would be such a bummer to like be able to have their, like, it'd be good to have, they have the phone, but then like they get transferred, they get a new number, they get a new phone, you're like lose complete contact with them. You're just like, oh man.
Yeah.
I wonder if it's easy to track them down.
Yeah. It's so sad for Mormons here because, or I feel bad for them because they got to wear like all their clothes, but it's Hawaii, right? So it's nice, but it's usually humid. Too, But I would be so depressed if I was a missionary in Hawaii as a Mormon, because they can't go in the water at all. Like they can't have fun.
Right.
And so like I would never want to do evangelism on the beach. No, because I'd be like, oh, I just wish I could go in there.
Is it because they can't? Is it immodest? Why can't they swim?
I used to know, but I can't remember.
Do you know why?
I don't. So usually back when I was, a teenager, and I was connected with the missionaries in our ward. They could play basketball and they could work out on Mondays, but that was it. My guess is they can't swim because drowning. Like they don't want people to go in the ocean because they don't want you doing anything that's risky. That's because the minute that starts happening, that's a PR night. Like you have a missionary that dies because he's out surfing and hits his head or something. Like that's a PR disaster.
Yeah, they had 2 missionaries die on the North Shore. That's why it was.
Wow.
Yeah, I remember them telling me that.
Oh, geez.
Yeah. They weren't even surfing. It was just like big waves, and they weren't even in the water very much. And they just
no
shore break. Yeah. It was crazy.
I've been thrown around there too.
Yeah.
Dude, I went up there and I've seen some of my favorite waves up there. Those are incredible.
Oh,
Like
Oahu
just
North
watching.
Shore?
Yeah, just like watching them up there. Yeah.
Yeah.
We helped plant a church in Kailua. And so I got to go out and preach there and like hang out. And then when we were there, we would go up north. It was the winter and those waves were fun.
Yeah, the winter waves are
What's the church called?
It was called Trade Winds. They merged with another one and it has a new name now. So I'd have to message you after. I can't.
All good, yeah.
But it was originally called Trade Winds.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
Cool.
Talking about like how integrated the culture of being a Mormon is right now, how hard that is to leave. What was that like for you? I know you talked about it a little bit, but was like your world falling apart when you deconverted and stuff like that? Or was it kind of fun because you're in college, you weren't thinking about it a lot, you tried to suppress it with all the other fun stuff you could do, or what was that like?
Yeah. Well, it was strange because I had two worlds, like I feel like college age people who understand this, like you have your world at school and then you have your home. And so my home world in a way was falling apart. Like it was falling apart, maybe isn't the right word. It was just everything I knew about it was now not true. Right. And we were, not only had I left Mormonism, but I was leaving the house. And so those roles were different between, father and son and father and mother and like my relationship with my siblings. And so when I was at school, it was great. When I was home, it was not. And my family didn't ostracize. They didn't kick me out. Like they didn't, shun me in any way. But my dad was intense about it. I mean, he was heartbroken. He was angry. And so we just had to work through that process in a way. That first summer I went home, it was brutal. I mean, it was not fun. By the second summer I went home, it was much better. And I remember feeling like, okay, it feels like we have our way forward now. And that worked for a while. And then when I converted to Christianity, as intense as he was when I left Mormonism, he was more intense with me when I converted to Christianity, when I told him I was going to be baptized.
Wow.
Yeah. Because I think in their... Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
I
was just going to ask.
Yeah. I think in their mind, they thought I would always go back.
That's hard,
that happens a lot in Mormonism. People go down, like they don't, like I officially resigned my name. I was out. But people will fall away. They call them Jack Mormons. They kind of leave the tenets of the faith, but then they come back. They come back when they get married, or they come back when they have a child. Like you see it in Christianity too. Like it's a route of I think just the human condition in a way. Like you're just figuring out life. Faith has to become your own. And I think they always thought that would happen. And then when I was baptized, that was a huge deal for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it was do you think they were more intense because that was the nail in the coffin of like, oh, he's not coming back? Or is it like, we don't like Christianity? Okay.
No, I think it was that. I think it was, he's not coming back. And now it's not like the story isn't, oh, Kyle's having a bad time or, his own personal rumspringa or whatever, like, but he's actually like out and he's pursuing something else. Like he believes this is who God is. And to them, that's a big deal. Saying, I'm not going to deal with it is one thing. Saying I'm actually living my life focused on this other way is completely different.
Yeah, definitely. Right. That's crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, man, that's so interesting that's crazy. Like that you did that. Like, I feel like I'd be so afraid. Like, I think I'm so much more, at least at that age, I was so much more filled with anxiety, I think. And I probably would have stayed, like, if it was myself in that situation. I'm sure eventually I would have like questioned things because I do that more.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, good job.
Yeah, I think it was so, for whatever reason, there's such a part of me that, Mormonism is so all encompassing. Like it takes over, it is your world in a way. Yeah. And the community, we talked about that already, like the community that you live and you breathe and you function in, it's them. And so I think it would have felt so disingenuous. It's so difficult to compartmentalize Mormonism if you're in Mormonism.
Yeah.
And it would have felt so disingenuous to me that I just couldn't couldn't conceive of a way to do it. And I'm not saying there aren't people who can, maybe that's just my personality, but, and then I would also say, like, I mean, I know this gets into theological questions as well, but in a way, like I felt like when I questioned Mormonism for the first time, that in a way that was a work of God in my mind. Like I don't think it's tough for me to see how I could have done that with everything I knew and understood at the time.
Right. One question I have. I'll go ahead for it. Do you want to go?
I was going to ask a question off that. What made you go to church then for the first time? Like, I feel like if I deconverted from a religion that was so all encompassing, and I know it was 5 years later for you, or 3 years later or something. But I feel like if I felt that lied to my whole life or something, that it'd be hard for me to try to accept an organized religion again.
Yeah. So just going off what I just said about it's hard to be disingenuous. It was just an attractive girl. That's why I went.
Nice.
So
nice.
Yeah. So I met
to convert.
I met this girl, and she was like, her group of girlfriends was friends with my group of guy friends, and she wouldn't pay much attention to me, and I was super angry about that. I was like, come on. And one night she said, hey, I've got to go home early. We were out just all eating at a buffet in Las Vegas.
Right.
And she was like, I got to go home early. I got to go to work. And I said, hey, I do too in the morning. Like, can I get a ride? I didn't, but I just wanted to get to know her.
Nice.
And we're walking to her car, and she has the fish, the Jesus fish on the back of her car. And I was immediately like, bummer, like, dang it. Like, because I felt so broken by faith and religion, betrayed by it. Like, I didn't want anything to do with it. And so we got in the car, and I'm an optimistic guy. So immediately I was like, maybe it's a used car,
Right.
But we got in the car, and I was like, hey, what is that on the back? And she said she's a Christian. And I said, well, what does that mean? I didn't know anything about Christianity. I was like, are you a Methodist, a Baptist? I had no idea what that would have meant, but I just wanted a label. And she's like, well, I go to a non-denominational church. I guess you could say like I'm a born again Christian. And then she's like, shares like the gospel with me. And I was just like, okay. And in the back of my head, I'm like thinking that's not that bad. And she's pretty cute. So I'll hang in here,
Worth it.
And so we got to be friends, and it was probably a few months later, she invited me to church. And the first time I went, like the only reason I went back was because it was easy. It's 55 minutes. They played rock music, and they gave out coffee and maple bars. And so I was like, sweet, I'll do this. And it was about the third time I went that the pastor preached a message and used himself as the illustration of depravity.
Wow.
And I was like, whoa, like I'd been taught you always like, to be honest, guys, the first few times I went, I saw a big mega church. They were trying to put chairs anywhere they could to fit people. And this guy was a great communicator. And I was like, hey, it's the same thing. It's just different. It's just dressed up differently. It's still about power. It's still about influence. It's still about like somehow controlling. And then he gave this message about like depravity and used himself and walked through his like sinful tendencies and ways that he had indulged even. And I was like, I've never seen anything like all my life. I'd been taught to worship men, worship prophets, worship, even exonerate like my dad. Like it goes back to my grandpa's question, what gives you the right to question? And he was saying, question me all day long. The pastor was. He was like, only thing I can bring you is Jesus. Like he's it. Like I'm gonna let you down. And as I'd love to say, I became a Christian that day, but that's what started the timer of like those 2.5, 3 years that I spent at the church, really deconstructing what I knew, wrestling through the wounds, the emotions, the feelings of betrayal, and then basically asking myself, I mean, what I used to always say is like, do I want to drink the Kool-Aid again? Like, am I really going to go there? And I know that sounds like kind of ridiculous, but that's just my brain thought about it that way.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it was a bit intense.
Wow. Crazy.
Yeah.
Man,
right on.
That's awesome. What would you say is the best way for people who want to still learn more about Mormons after this podcast? Where should they go read? I know you recommended a book, I Love Mormons, already. Is there anything else that they should go to? Any podcasts, any kind of books, anything like that?
Yeah, there's one. So that book, like I said, I don't think many of your watchers, listeners, I don't think they would read that book and go like, oh, I've never considered it. But it's just cool to see how he tracks through life with them. I mean, if you want to understand Mormonism from its beginning and everything that kind of is the foundation, there's a book called One Nation Under Gods. And it's like, that's the trick. Like with, a guy by the last name of Abanes, Abanes, wrote that. I always forget if it's Marcus Abanes, I believe. But just if you look up One Nation Under God's last name of the author is Abanes. It's a fantastic read. If you want to know, like, read about Joseph Smith, which if you want to understand Mormonism, you have to understand the life of Joseph Smith. There's a book by Fawn Brody that's called No Man Knows My History. She was originally LDS when she started out writing it. And by the end, she had been excommunicated because she revealed a lot of what he had done. Wow. I got a million more, but I just feel like those three would give you a sense and an understanding. If you want to hear something from a Mormon. So here's what I would say. Like, if there are Mormons watching, and you're like, I'm not going to read those books. Those books are not written by Christian. Those books are written by Christians or who knows what. There's a book by Robert Millett, who is a BYU scholar. It says in the title of it is a different Jesus ? And he takes in that book and he outlines the evangelical understanding of Jesus and the Christian understanding and the Mormon understanding of Jesus. And I don't think he does a disservice to the evangelical position. Like he'll say things like, yeah, Mormons, we believe in grace, but we call it conditional grace. And then he'll outline what he means by conditional grace. And of course we would say that's not grace, but that's what he said. And so I'm just saying, if you're a Mormon watching, check out that book and you will see the differences there. Again, it's been a bit of my life, so I don't want to like overload too much, but those four are good tracks.
Wow.
Right.
Do you find yourself talking to Mormons often, just in life or no?
We all the time when I was in Salt Lake. Now that I'm in California, it's a little bit to be honest, guys, it's wild how God brings me face to face with Mormons. So just the other day, I preached a sermon at the church we're a part of. And after I come down and there's a guy there and he says, I had no idea why I came here today. He tells me his life story, how he grew up in Mormonism. He was a closeted alcoholic. And then as his alcoholism took over, it became known. He then had to go to jail. He came out. He's been sober for, something like 12 years, but it went back to Mormonism, rebaptized and everything. And it felt like God had sent him to the church that day. And as I gave some of my story in the message, like he was like, we gotta keep talking about this. And he's trembling and he's tearing up.
Wow.
And guys, that's not a abnormal thing. Since I moved to California, it feels more like these crazy, like directed meetings that happen often. In Utah, it was all the time. And it was, both meetings like that and then meetings just because, you're just going to run into them. And so, that's a bit of it.
That's awesome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's amazing. It's so cool that God's using you in so many amazing ways like that to reach people out of what you came from. That's like, because you carry all that authority. Because we could talk to Mormons and say things as well, but you coming out of it, walking that road just gives you so much more clout in their minds of like, wow, like it's possible. Like I'm looking at a real life example.
Clout.
Yeah. I don't disagree with you. The only thing I would say in that is what I've found is there's that person who listens to me, but there's another person who's maybe in Mormonism and having some problems who will not talk to me at all because I'm someone who's left the faith and turned their back on it. And so they see me as like, and so I totally agree. Like it's weird. It's super bind. It's almost like they fit into one of the two camps. So they'll either want to only talk to me or want nothing to do with me.
Wow.
And they'll only want to talk to like other Christians or people. You'll see them like as they come to church, they're like, they'll want to talk to me after they've crossed some level of like, is this not true? I remember one lady who wouldn't talk to me at all. And then all of a sudden she just breaks down in tears and she's like, wow, this might not be true. And she's just sobbing. And then we had like conversation for the first time. It's intense how it can just get in your mind and feel like this, 400-pound weight that you can't shake.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
For sure.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I don't have any more questions. Do you?
It's not really like a big question, but I'm just out of curiosity. How do they elect prophets? Is it like, will the prophet then passes his authority down when he dies?
Fantastic question. So it is supposed to be like, so there's they have this structure where there's the 12 apostles, they call it the quorum of the 12. And then out of that, they choose a prophet. There's a prophet, and then he chooses his first and second counselor out of the quorum of the 12. Now, it's supposed to be that quorum of the 12, when a prophet dies, that gets together and says who the next prophet is going to be. But what has always happened ever since it was instituted in the way that they do it now is when there comes this new prophet, the person who has the most seniority in the quorum of the 12, like the one who's been a general authority the longest, becomes the president of the quorum of the 12. And when the prophet dies, that person is always elevated to the next prophet.
Interesting.
Okay.
And so I don't know if I explained that in a way that makes sense, but like, it's basically whoever's the senior ranking member of the quorum of the 12, who's not the prophet, becomes the next prophet. They don't say that, like they say like the God, like they go before God and he tells them, but there's never like any, there's not Mormons, they're not waiting for the white smoke or anything like in Catholicism. Like, it's just, you kind of know who it's going to be.
Right. Okay.
Cool. Wow.
Right on.
We've got one question left that we always ask everybody that comes on the show. That's our guest. And it's a fun little question, not very serious, but if you were locked in a gladiator arena, you're one of those Christians that got thrown in there, and you've got one predatory animal coming at you. You got to fight it. What is the biggest predatory animal you think you could survive against with just a melee weapon of your choosing? So you get to choose the animal and the weapon. And so it's about how big of an animal you think you could take down.
How big of an animal could I take down?
It's predatory. So it's predatory, though.
It's a predatory animal. Okay.
Yeah.
Man.
For example, Ethan always says he takes like this dagger kind of thing, and he goes against
I take a good sized dagger, maybe like 1.5 foot long blade, and a hyena.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I always choose like a big cat, like a jaguar or something like that, or mountain lion.
Yeah.
And then I take a spear.
Okay. So this is going to be a little bit ridiculous, but in Utah, like where you run in the mountains a lot. I love to run. So you can run in the trails a lot. And there's cougars, there's mountain lions.
Oh yeah.
And so there's even viral video of it somewhere where a guy fended off a cougar with his iPhone by getting it to flash different things at the cougar, and it would like back up. Whoa. So I know that's not a melee weapon. I wish you would let me choose. I would use an iPhone and a cougar, but but because I feel like I've heard of very successful attempts at evading cougars, I would pick a cougar and like a baseball bat or something.
Nice.
Okay.
Nice.
Yeah.
Good choice.
If you won't give me an iPhone, I get it. It's gladiator.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Awesome. So the person just like took its flashlight out and was just like,
something where like he kept like strobing the light.
Oh, okay.
It was like freaking him out. Like it was, and then it like would run away but come back and run away and come back, and he was able to like keep going.
Wow, interesting.
So yeah,
cool.
What a resilient man. I would have been like, I'm dead.
Yeah, I think I would have been.
I don't have that thought process. Like,
what
can I experiment with that I have right now to defend myself?
I'd be like, I'm just gonna. I would think if I thought like I'm gonna die, I think I would be like, I'm gonna go down fighting.
Yeah.
And I would just charge it as fast as I could,
and
screaming. I'm like,
yeah.
One of us is dying.
Yeah, we both might.
One of us is taken out. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Well, Kyle, thanks so much for coming on today. We had a great time.
Yeah, thanks.
I know I learned a lot. I'm sure you learned a lot too. Hopefully our listeners, you guys learned a lot. It's been very informative. And hey, maybe we'll have you on again in the future. That'd be awesome.
Great. Thanks, guys.
All right. Thanks, Kyle.
Yeah. See ya.
See ya. Everybody else, thank you for watching. We're on all the social medias, all that good stuff. You know where to find us. Thanks for coming back. See ya.